everyone. Welcome to our Urban Fowl Management Program today. I'd like to introduce everybody. I'm Jacqueline Jones-Doyle with Tarrant County AgriLife Extension. With us today is Liz Rudd from Dallas County. And our speakers today are Rachel Richter with Texas Parks and Wildlife and Adam Henry. And Adam, I can never remember the acronym for the department you're with, and granted, I know it falls under AgriLife. And you're muted.
So USDA Wildlife Services.
Perfect, thank you. So a little housekeeping today as we go through the presentations. If you've got any questions, if you would, please put them in the chat box and we will address those as we move forward with the presentations. We also ask that you be sure that you mute your microphones. That way we can kind of keep some of the background noise to a minimum. We're also going to ask that once we get started that we also turn the videos off. It just helps with bandwidth as we go through. So with that being said, I will turn the presentation over to Rachel. And Rachel, you are muted.
Thank you all, everyone, for spending your Friday afternoon watching this webinar. So I'm going to start off talking about the negative, the downside of feeding ducks. Yeah.
You're sounding a little off compared to what you were a minute ago.
I can speak closer. So just so everyone knows, my office has a tin roof, and it just started raining harder right as we started talking. Can everyone hear me? Can y'all hear me better if I speak closer? Yes? Okay. Are y'all seeing the full screen of the PowerPoint? Or are you seeing presenter mode right now?
Yes, we're seeing the full screen.
PowerPoint. Full screen, great. Okay. Now that we got that out of the way, my name is Rachel Richter. I'm an urban wildlife biologist here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I'm here to tell you today why you should not feed ducks. This is something that is like, feeding ducks is a very commonplace activity. Like, most of us have probably done this at some point in our lives. I am guilty of being a person who fed ducks as a child because it's just something that kind of everyone does. So no one really stops to think about the impact that it has. So unfortunately, while this might kind of seem like a harmless activity on its surface, there's a lot of really bad things that can happen from people going out and feeding ducks. And so that's what we're going to cover today. One of the kind of big problems, just right off the bat that sticks out is the type of food that people are feeding ducks is usually in itself problematic. Ducks and geese are not supposed to eat bread or popcorn or potato chips. These things can be very bad for them. It doesn't resemble what their natural diet is. And if like one person came along and gave a duck some popcorn, that wouldn't be a huge deal. But at parks where there is a lot of duck feeding happening, sit and watch for a while and you'll notice like it is a constant stream of people feeding these animals. And that can really be problematic. So, these foods are very low in nutritional value for these birds, and they're not getting the nutrients that they need. So sort of like I could go and buy a party-sized bag of Doritos, and I could eat the entire thing in one sitting, and it would be delicious, and I would probably feel pretty full, but I also would probably feel pretty crappy. at the end of that. So it's the same kind of thing. They're big on junk food that's not good for them. These are kind of some of the natural foods that ducks should be eating. These are the things that naturally occur in the environment that ducks feed on. Different types of ducks will eat different things. But you know, it's generally going to be some sort of plants, algae, invertebrates, or even small fish, depending on the species of the duck. And you'll notice this is a variety of things. And that kind of variety, these things are going to have much more diverse nutrients and things like that. So it's much healthier, much more balanced diet. This is what they should be eating. The food that we feed ducks is not healthy for the ducks. And so it can cause a lot of issues with their nutritional development of the ducks. So one example would be metabolic bone disease, which can lead to deformities, and it also just makes the ducks' bones extremely weak, so they break easily. Metabolic bone disease is often caused by a calcium deficiency in their diet. This duck in this picture, I know it kind of might look like it's running out with its wings like happily stretched, but what's actually going on, this is a condition called angel wing, and this duck actually doesn't have the ability to lay its wings flat. So what happens here, usually this condition happens when ducks grow rapidly and the bones are weak, and so the can't support the flight feathers, and the bone rotates outward. So the bones are actually rotated outward, and that's what's causing those feathers to come out. You also see ducks with, nutritional deficiencies. They're not able to fly. You might sometimes see deformities in the bill. And there's just a variety of physical conditions that can be caused by them not having proper nutrition. Angel wing is sometimes thought there may be a potential link from the animals getting too much protein in their diet, which is interesting because sometimes people who don't want to feed bread will feed like duck feed to the ducks, and that actually can sometimes have too much protein and cause this issue. So it's really best not to feed these animals at all, and let them rely on their native diet. So another issue with feeding ducks is that it attracts the ducks into one area. So it really kind of concentrates the density, concentrates the duck population in one spot. And if we've learned anything from the last few years, it's that if you have a lot of individuals in one area, it makes it much easier for disease to spread because there's more contact between individuals. And there are several diseases that ducks can get and die from, including things like duck plague, avian cholera, avian botulism, avian influenza is a big concern right now. There's also a disease that they can get from a fungal infection that they can get that can be caused by food that is left in the water that can start getting moldy, and then the ducks come along and eat it, and it can make them sick. When we feed wild animals, it also causes them to lose their fear of people. And so they tend to start hanging, they get positive associations with being around people. And so they tend to choose places to hang out that are near people, which can be problematic in a lot of ways. So I've worked with communities before that have had to close down pools because there were so many ducks hanging around the pool and pooping in the water that it was not safe to let people swim in the water. Obviously, that can be a big problem. We also frequently get calls about from people who have ducks that have nested in an undesirable area. And people either don't want the duck hanging around or they're concerned for the safety of the duck. And that's something that, you know, it's more likely to happen if they don't have, if the ducks are overpopulated. And also they're not scared of being near people. If they have a high tolerance for human activity, they're more likely to hang out in these areas. Also, geese can be pretty mean sometimes. Usually, you know, most people I think have a story of being attacked, or at least, you know, having a geese look at you the wrong way and having a goose look at you the wrong way and be kind of mean. Usually, geese act aggressively. It's because they have eggs or young nearby and they're concerned about defending them. But you know, this activity, when we're encouraging them to hang out near people and they're habitually good to people and they're not afraid of people, that increases the likelihood that we're going to run into geese that are having this kind of defensive, aggressive behavior. Also, it's important to note that a lot of the geese and ducks that we are feeding are actually species that are not native to Texas. So these are species that are invasive. They do not belong here. They might actually be causing harm to our native duck species in the environment. So I've got just a few examples here of, you know, what some of these non-native duck species ducks might look like. A lot of them are hybrids between domestic, you know, various domestic duck breeds, or even domestic ducks and wild ducks. So there's lots of different species. This one right here, the black and white and red one is known as a muscovy duck. This is a really common invasive duck species in our area. And then, like I said, we've got various domestic hybrids. This guy right here, you can see if you look at its bill, it's got, it's kind of crossed over and saggy looking. And that might be a genetic issue, or it could also be a nutritional issue as well. To give you an idea of what our native ducks look like, so what the ducks that are supposed to be here look like, this is just a screenshot that I took from iNaturalist. If you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's a citizen science website where people are able to go and document living things that they have found. And so these are basically the most commonly observed native duck species on iNaturalist in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. To give you an idea, you don't have to memorize all of these, but you know, we've got a lot of really cool looking native duck species, and we should be focusing on improving the habitat for these species and supporting biodiversity here in North Texas. It's also important to keep in mind that when you are feeding ducks, it's rare that ducks are really going to be the only ones that take advantage of that food resource that you're putting out there. So you might be throwing food out for ducks. Ducks probably aren't going to be able to eat it all, especially if it's like a constant stream of people just coming in and giving them food. So a lot of times there's leftover food in the area, and that can attract other critters that you don't want hanging around and you don't want to start associating people with food either. So rodents are a big one, as well as things that might eat the rodents, like coyotes or bobcats. I worked with one city a few years ago that was having issues with coyotes just getting a little too friendly with people at a park. And they found that the coyotes were hanging around the pond where people were feeding ducks. And some people did the right thing and tried to haze the coyotes by picking up a rock and throwing it. And the coyote ran up to the rock, like it was clearly expecting a treat. And so it was obvious that people were coming to the pond and they were feeding the ducks, but then they were also throwing some food to the coyotes. which can present that can become a serious issue if coyotes become too habituated to being around people. So feeding ducks can have impacts other wildlife species as well. It also has a significant impact on the environment. It can really cause a decline in the quality of the habitat. So one thing that we'll commonly see with ducks, in an area that has way too many ducks, is you'll see the vegetation has been trampled down, and so sometimes it's just bare dirt like what you see in this photo. And plants are super important to have, especially around water bodies, because they hold soil in place and they slow water down. And so what you have here is you're going to have significant problems with erosion and increased sedimentation in that pond, so a decrease in water quality, and also anything else that needed that vegetation to survive is going to have a hard time hanging around with just bare dirt, right? This what you're seeing doesn't do anything for butterflies or other pollinators or songbirds and things like that. Things that we also want to be able to experience in our parks. Ducks also poop a lot. They poop a lot. I've seen kind of different estimates. Some of them, especially like young ones, can poop like once every 30 minutes. That's a lot of poop. And all of that poop is going to go into the water eventually. They'll poop directly into the water, but also the stuff on the outside. It rains like it is today, and it will run in pretty quickly. With that, bird poop has a lot of nutrients in it, and that buildup of excess nutrients in the water can lead to an imbalance and cause a process called eutrophication, which basically all those nutrients in the water can cause an algae bloom, which then the algae kind of takes all of the dissolved oxygen out of the water, which can lead to a fish kill. So it can be a big problem. People putting too much food out for the ducks don't eat it all. The food sits in the water, it can clog up pipes or water feet or like fountains and stuff in the water, and it also can become moldy and contribute to a decline in water quality, as well as fungal infections that we talked about earlier. Also, it can be really expensive to maintain hardscapes in areas like this, so like sidewalks and benches, playgrounds. All that stuff gets covered in poop. The city has to come in and pressure spray it off, and that can be really, really expensive over time. So what can you do? There are a few different options. The first starting point is it's important to remember most people don't realize that feeding ducks is a bad thing. Most people don't realize that feeding ducks really has negative impacts, not just for the ducks, but for the entire ecosystem. And so it's important to start with outreach and education. So put up signs, letting people know that this is kind of hey, this is a bad idea. Please don't feed the ducks, and here's why. So letting people know about these negative impacts of feeding ducks is really important. I also recommend, I think every city out there should have a wildlife feeding ordinance on the books. This is, not just specific to ducks, but for feeding all wildlife. It's great for ducks, especially if you have a water quality issue, you have something you can enforce with. But like that situation I was talking about with the coyotes earlier that were getting handouts from people there to feed the ducks. That city had a feeding ordinance already on the books that they just weren't enforcing at the time. And because they were concerned about the behavior of the coyotes, They put up signs telling people like, hey, we have a feeding ordinance, and if you are caught feeding wildlife, this is how much you will be fined. And it stopped, and the issue went away, and the coyotes stopped approaching people pretty quickly. So having a feeding ordinance, even if you know you're not going to be able to enforce it all the time, having it in case you run into an issue, either with water quality or other critters that are being fed, having it already in place, so you can bring it out when you need it, has been really useful to a lot of different communities in our area. A lot of times you'll see well-meaning people suggest like, hey, bread and potato chips is really bad for ducks. Let's feed them healthy stuff. And I gotta be the killjoy and say, don't feed them at all. Because even if you're feeding them stuff that is nutritionally better for the ducks, that might help with, some of the deformities from improper nutrients and things like that. So you might not see angel meat or getting an appropriate diet, but even things that are healthy that we feed them still don't have the same nutrients that their natural diet would. So we're never going to be able to replicate what they should be eating. And then also it doesn't address the issue of overcrowding and disease and all of those negative impacts to the environment. So it's really best to just not feed the ducks at all. They don't need our help. They can survive on their own, and let's not encourage them to overpopulate themselves. So our native ducks, they are all legally protected, so you're much more limited in what you can and cannot do in controlling them. So for example, if you had a, we talked about the nests earlier. If you have a duck that has laid a nest in your yard and it is a native duck species, that would be highly unusual, but if it is, let's say it's a mallard, that would be the most likely culprit, where it may be, well, anyway, I'm not going to get into that, but it may or may not be a native mallard, but they say it's a mallard. You have to assume that that is a legally protected duck, and you can't do anything to move it or relocate it. But if it's a species that is clearly not native, like let's say it's a Muscovy duck, and you don't want that nest in your yard, you can just get rid of the eggs, So our native ducks have protections. Our non-native ducks do not. And so you have a lot more, there's no state regulations for non-native waterfowl, so you have a lot more flexibility in how you choose to manage them. So things like oiling or addling the eggs, which is basically coating the eggs in oil or picking it up and shaking it and putting it down, those makes the eggs non-viable. And that will not decrease the duck population, but it will stop the duck population. It will slow the increase of the duck population. So that doesn't really address, so that can help, but you're gonna see it's gonna take a long time to get to see the results of that help, because you're not addressing all of the ducks that are currently on the grounds that are causing all sorts of issues for that habitat and impacting the water quality. So if you want to see a more immediate impact, trapping and removing the ducks is going to give you the desired results quicker. Combined with that education of addressing the underlying issue, and encouraging people not to feed the ducks. And Adam is going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of how that kind of works in his presentation. So it's important to remember, people who are feeding ducks, they generally are doing it because they want a way to interact with nature. So I think it's important to kind of couple that message of, hey, you can't feed the ducks, but here are some other really great kind of nature-friendly things that you can do. Like instead of feeding them, take some binoculars and just watch them kind of go about their, natural behaviors and what they do in the park. Look at some other birds that are there too. You can contribute to citizen science projects like iNaturalist or eBird. These are websites where, as I mentioned earlier, with iNaturalist, people document living things that they found, and it's really helpful. You saw I used it just today to kind of show y'all an idea of the most common natural species that are native duck species that are here in North Texas. Taking pictures, just learning about wildlife, or taking steps to improve their local park as well. So maybe organize a trash pickup or start maintaining some native plants. And I think that, it's really important with this message to say the goal here is to promote healthy ecosystems. We want ponds that look like this, that can support a wide variety of species and a wide and have healthy water quality and support lots of different ducks and other wildlife in a way that's healthy and sustainable. We want ponds that look like this, not that other one that has just completely bare dirt all around it. And most people who, instead of just focusing on this one species that people are feeding, we should focus on promoting, what can we do to support the entire ecosystem? And I think combining that message, of we're not feeding the ducks anymore, but it's going to be so much better for the ecosystem as a whole, can really help kind of convince people that feeding the ducks is not the way to go. And I think we've got a few minutes for me to take questions if anyone has them.
To place those in the chat for our presenters. And at this time, it doesn't look like we have any questions. Thank you, Rachel. So at this time, I would like to turn the meeting over to Mr. Adam Henry for the next portion of our presentations.
Well, thank you all very much. Let me get my screen all sorted out here real quick, and we will move over and share that page on the full view. Can't make my bar tab go down, and I can't share from the. Hold on just a second. All these little things you don't think about. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Can everybody?
You're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to take off where Rachel left off and cover more of the urban goose management. And of course, this is more of the wild bird side of it. We'll get into kind of some options for the domestic duck population reduction along with the geese at the tail end. But real quick, we'll talk about who we are. Obviously, we are, again, part of the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, as Liz and Jacqueline talked about early when they introduced us. We are overseen by the USDA Wildlife Services Program on the national level. And then we also have a third partner, the Texas Wildlife Damage Management Association, that makes up our Texas Wildlife Services Program. We've worked on many projects, health and human safety. i.e. urban coyote issues with human interactions, airport safety, you name it, we've had our hands in it. Some of the disease sampling going on across the nation right now for high path avian influenza, along with other disease vectors and things like that. We have a hand in doing a lot of that sampling and testing. Facilities and helping with building protection from all kinds of critters, crops and timber. Our bread and butter that brought us to the table obviously was livestock back in about 1915 when we started helping the sheep and goat raisers industry from predation. And we dabble in the endangered species side of the house with things like predator protection on our prairie chickens or hog predation on sea turtle nests down on the Gulf Coast, all the way out to the Trans-Pecos with reintroduction of bighorn sheep or pronghorn antelope that's going on right now. So we dabble in a lot of wildlife. But let's talk about our resident Canada geese. And I think that's the big caveat and the big thing we need to think about is resident. These are birds that really do not migrate. They're here all year long. We have a healthy population in North Texas. And I've been as far south as about Waco in the Temple area, Killeen area to do some goose management, but we really have it that side about that Waco north is where we see our resident Canada geese. Not too many other places in the state do we get in contact with the geese. But that being said, our geese are anywhere from 5 to 14 pounds. Average for what I'm seeing here in North Texas is about a 10-pound adult goose. They don't sexually mature or have their first clutch of eggs until they're 3 years old. So there's 2 years that we get these birds that are still pretty much adult birds, but they don't necessarily start laying eggs and mating. They do mate for life, so they pair up, and those pairs come together and raise a clutch. In March through April is our nesting season. For a lot of our fowl, that's the prime time for laying eggs and having babies on the ground. So anywhere from that 2 to 9 eggs in a clutch, but again, 6. Most of my clutches I see have about 6 eggs in them here in North Texas. And when we get to talking about some of the other things to do to reduce that, that's a pretty important thing on knowing how many eggs are going to be in that clutch. They sit there for about 28 days. And then during that 28-day period, just after those chicks hatch, we roll into what's called a molt season. And that's anywhere from 20 to 40 days. Usually about 30 days here that we see here. Sometime around the middle of June into the early part of July is where we traditionally see our geese molt. We do, on those juvenile birds, we do have what's called a molt migration. So as those birds aren't really tied down by raising a clutch, they're free to move right before they molt. And they know their wings start feeling funny and the feathers are getting loose. And so they really know that, hey, the wheels are coming off this plane. We got to get somewhere to a repair shop. And it's not uncommon for the birds that have been sitting on your property or in a city lake or on a golf course doing damage. It's not uncommon for them to pick up and move just before they molt to another property. And that is one of the challenging things when we look at trying to manage those populations, is that all of the birds that are coming are not there. Some of them may leave. Mineral Wells, the golf course in Mineral Wells, a week before we did a roundup, they had 300 birds on their pond. And the week we got there was 150. Pretty sure they went over to the state park, and half of them that weren't raising babies on the lake were over at the state park and weren't able to get those rounded up. But we did remove the 150 resident birds that stayed put, and were able to make a dent in that issue that they had there. But as Rachel touched about on fecal matter deposits in our water, a goose deposits about 3 pounds of fecal matter a day into the water or on the land. And so that's big concerns when we have city parks and playgrounds and human activity that interacts with those birds. That it makes high financial costs for cities. Several of the cities that I've worked in have had full-time staff that have spent all day cleaning up after the geese just to do it again the very next day. So it becomes a very, very big money draw to have to keep that clean with a lot of geese around. Grass destruction. Those birds eat grass. They're walking around almost grazing like cows. In fact, I would go to say they probably do more damage to turf grass on golf courses than the feral hogs actually do, because they're physically pulling the grass and eating the grass structure, whereas hogs will typically roll that sod over and it can be laid back down. And so they are very high on that destruction of our grasses. Again, golf courses are luxury items, but front yards, I've had a community that had geese walking through the community in the front yards, and basically folks were not able to grow grass because they were eating it all the way down to bare dirt. The big one, again, is right now is our disease concerns. Again, that health and human safety issue. The common ones, Salmonella, E. coli, or basically anything that we are dealing with these days. Giardia is another one that's a waterborne parasite that we see transmitted to humans. There's several others. The big one to talk about right now is the high path AI. It is prevalent. It is here in our wild birds. Me personally, have sampled hunter harvested birds earlier in the year that did test positive for the high path AI. We've seen it in an owl, tested by, I believe, Parks and Wildlife tested an owl. We've had our Animal Health Commission come up positive on some backyard chickens in Dallas here recently. Went out. So that's a big concern as far as what these birds are doing and what they're carrying and moving around. So especially for our backyard poultry folks, it is a concern that we have a wild bird that is bringing that or potentially carrying that in or transmitting it. If you took your kids to the park and played in it and then came home and were out backyard with your chickens, now we've potentially transmitted if we didn't have good biosecurity going around those chickens. So very big concern. Always something to be thinking about right now, and it's a hot topic right now in the wildlife world. Some of our, go ahead.
In the chat box for you.
Yep.
When you removed the geese from the Mineral Wells Golf Course, where did they go? And you may have addressed it, and I may have missed it.
Well, we'll talk about that one. So anytime we remove geese, it has a lethal solution. So they were humanely euthanized and disposed of, again, mainly for that disease control issue. We also have airports that we are worried about. So those birds cause a huge flight safety risk in the Metroplex. Most of our data shows that those birds need to go 200 miles from your capture site and then obviously they're molted so they can't fly. So that's the best time to move them is when they can't fly. But we all know geese have a great homing ability. There's lots of movies. Hollywood's made multiple movies of flying geese thousands and thousands of miles and having them return every year. So in an overall health and human safety issue, and obviously flight safety, aviation safety, we know several years ago we had a buzzard that struck over at the JRB in Fort Worth, and we had a plane go down right there, and that was a naturally occurring buzzard flying around doing its own thing. So we definitely don't want to be a part of birds returning back to those areas when we try to move. So they were a lethal solution. Harassment options, when we get into doing the precursor or trying to move birds before they become a problem, there are several options. Lights, and we'll show some pictures here of blinking lights that can be placed in the ponds or waterways to discourage them roosting on the bank. Had some folks recently, several places on golf courses I've seen over the years, the coyote decoys, those are readily available. Big thing with the coyote decoy, just like any other scarecrow device, is it has to be moved. There needs to be some motion in that decoy throughout the day. Geese are not as bad as say, obviously crows, but you do need to move it multiple times throughout the day. You can't just plunk it down and leave it. They're going to wind up not being afraid of it. So there has to be that fear factor in the new movement just a little bit. Doesn't have to move much, but it does have to move just a little bit. For the folks in town wanting to get very aggressive with our pyrotechnics, that's another great tool, but most of the time we have city restrictions on using fireworks, so we need to work hand in hand with our cities. If you are a city municipality listening, this is something that you should have in your repertoire for moving flocks of birds or anything else. It should be something that would be standard for it. They don't cost a lot, relatively inexpensive, but we do have some regulations on inside city limits for their use. Dogs are a great tool. I know we there's a video that I sent to Jacqueline for y'all to watch after this. And there's several companies that use collie dogs and the herding dogs to harass geese and move them off of flat lands, obviously around airports and things like that, city parks, on dry land. Dogs in the water make it tough, so there are other tools, remote control boats and different kind of specialty tools that can be used in the water and aquatic world to chase those birds off once the dogs stop on land. And then obviously some flagging and flaggery can be used just to disrupt the plane of vision so that they, again, continue to move on and not hang out. Some of those supplies that we would need for that can be bought at a company called Reed Joseph. I think if you put a .com on the end of that Reed Joseph, it's going to take you right to that website. Another one out of Canada is the Margot Supplies. And those two companies are primarily the two that specialize in avian harassment tools. They sell the bird bangers and bird screamers. Again, these are handheld tools. You would need their launcher to launch them. It looks like a starter pistol. Again, very cheap, very economical to have. And as always, we want to make sure we have our safety glasses and ear protection and things like that so that we have our PPE when we're using a device like that. But again, I warn on the average citizen having this stuff, there is some issues in our municipalities with discharging that. As we were talking about that light, so this is our Away with Geese floating light. This is a commercial version. And when we put that in the water, kind of right out off the bank right there with those geese is where we want to place that. It's going to need an anchor on the bottom of that device there on the left. And you just set it out there and it comes on at night and it blinks. Something about the wave pattern of that yellow blinky light causes them not to like to roost on the banks. We've got a subdivision in Fort Worth that has purchased these and put them out, and the birds have, last I've talked to them, the birds have decided to move on, and we don't have a lot of birds like they did during the molting season, which is common. They should move away, but this should help keep them coming back. If you wanted a low-cost alternative to that, it doesn't have to be expensive. These guys are pretty pricey for the commercial version. Just your standard utility blinking light for road construction. You can find those at Harbor Freight. They're at nominal fee. Takes a 6 or 12 volt battery, and you can build your own little support for it, as we see right here, and we can stick them out. Again, just depends on how ingenious you are and how handy with some household tools. And you can make your own blinky light and dissuader. In this case, you can also float that on like a pool float or a raft of some sort. Hold any kind of styrofoam or cardboard. It could be floated in the pond and keep those birds from roosting on the bank. So lots of tools. Again, this is in conjunction with some harassment going on and nighttime activity. That light's going to blink. It'll go off during the day. One big thing about this one here is it doesn't have the daytime sensor that some of those other lights have, so it is going to just continue to go all day long, which is no big deal. When we want it to be active is at night when those birds are coming to roost along the shoreline and help kind of disrupt their sleeping pattern. As we talked about, Canada geese and our wild birds are covered under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. They are part of also covered under Chapter 64 of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Code that mirrors the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. Parks and Wildlife defers to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So if we were going to talk about lethal removal for an individual or a property, then the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is where we go for that permission. That is handled through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you would apply. There's an application form on their website, and they're going to also ask for a Form 37 from Wildlife Services. So you would be calling me back, looking for that Form 37 to accompany your application. If you are going to do a egg oiling or register the flock, let's say you had a flock of Canada geese. Let's say we had 10 birds. And they're there every year, and now we've started having more and more, and we want to do something, but we don't necessarily want all the birds to go away. We can do what's called egg oiling, and you are allowed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to register your resident Canada goose flock. There's not any other birds that I'm aware of that we can register in egg oil that way. But it allows you to oil those eggs so that the embryos are not viable. What it does when we do that is that the goose doesn't, when we take those eggs away during the nesting season and the laying season, she's going to automatically go find a new place to lay eggs. That place could be in an area that we can't see. She may try to hide that nest, and so it may defeat the oiling process. So if we oil them, leave them there, we're going to mark those eggs so we know which one were laid in the nest when we oiled the first time. We're going to come back about 10 to 14 days later, and we're going to reapply oil to those eggs and check for any new eggs. It's important that we do that second oiling so that we make sure we get the 100% vegetable oil coated all over that egg and make sure we stop that embryo from being viable. Again, that deprecation permit application is one way that you would go. They're, again, potentially for a trap and relocate, but again, with high path AI concerns right now, I doubt anybody's going to really want to be doing the relocation. It's not a guarantee that they're not going to come back. And again, we've got populations that are too high and we want to reduce them. So moving them somewhere, having a landowner that wants to receive those wild birds is always an issue. You must have a landowner willing to receive them. We don't just get to take them to the wild spaces. Funny thing is, I've tried to take birds to wild places, and those folks that manage those wild places turn me down. So they're not wanting those birds there either. So it does allow for potentially a lethal removal on that end of it is kind of the preferred method. When we do the roundups are a faster solution. The egg oiling probably is going to take about 5 years before you see a difference in your reduction in your population. Mainly because you've got attrition that has to happen, natural death and mortality have to happen. You're stopping right now reproduction, but your juvenile birds that were 1 and 2 years old are fixing to come ahead and be viable for pairing up and breeding the next season. So you have to work through those generations that were left behind when the oiling started. So when we get past about 25 birds, really when we get past about 10, we need to be thinking about doing a bigger, faster reduction. And a few birds is good with our roundups. I never guarantee that we're going to take 100% because they molt at different times. But there's different variations in 1 or 2 days and 5 days in that molting cycle makes a difference. If a bird came in 5 days before everybody else, then they've got viable wings and they're back and able to fly by the time we get there sometimes. So invariably you will have birds back, but what we're trying to do is reduce that number to an acceptable level so that we can have a healthy waterway. What Rachel was talking about, we want healthy ponds and streams, and an acceptable level is a few breeding pairs, not multiples in that area. Oh, now my computer doesn't want to go. Did it to me this way the last time, didn't it? Oh, goodness. I would lose VPN with the sun shining, wouldn't I? Can y'all still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. So my secure VPN on my government computer dropped right as the sun is shining in the window. So let me on that real quick and we'll get up and running. But if you have any questions while we got a little downtime on that?
Adam, there's one in the chat.
Okay.
You want me to read it to you, or you can't pull up chat, can you?
I can't pull it up right now if you don't mind reading it to me.
Sure. So Donna is asking, when you remove the geese from the MW golf course, where did they go?
Right. I think I touched on that earlier. Did we talk about that? We euthanized those birds and disposed of them.
I don't see any others in the chat, but those of you who are in this program, if you want to unmute and ask him any questions, please feel free to.
So I'm going to keep talking while I'm going to make my, since y'all can hear me, I'll keep talking over my program here. How this relates to, let's say we've got domestic ducks on a pond and we've got too many. In years past, we had the availability of an immobilization drug that we could feed those domestic ducks and then remove them. That drug has gone away, and so it's kind of left us with a kind of a void on what to do on how to remove domestic ducks. One thing that we have done earlier this year, I went to Midland, and we were successful in removing 91 domesticated ducks off of a pond with the same style of goose roundup that we do for our geese with a drive net. And I've got a picture in that drive net. If I can get my computer back to working and wanting to talk to me here, we will get it up and working. Basically, it's a B shape with the orange safety netting, and it comes into a holding pen. And basically, those birds had been fed so much, we shook a bag of corn and they came right running to us at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so we loaded the first half up in the trailer, and then we reopened and reset our holding cage and got on the water and pushed those rest of those birds right up on the bank. And again, shook a bag and they came right up to us, and we kept on pushing them into the drive net, into the holding pen, and we were able to load those birds up in about 30 minutes. And so that kind of opened my eyes that maybe we could be able to do some drive netting and driving of our domesticated ducks. The big thing about our domesticated ducks is that most of them don't fly a whole lot. I know our Muscovies are flyers, but most of the time they're kind of overfed, so they really aren't big flyers. They might fly a few feet and then drop. Early in the morning during the dark, they're not apt to fly as much. And so here we go. There's a picture of our egg oiling. So real quick, there's a picture of how we would apply the oil to the egg. There's a video. That's the link in the YouTube video that I was talking about on Canada Goose egg oiling basics. And that's a USDA video that's on YouTube. Anybody wants to watch it, give you some more in-depth stuff on what you need to do in that process and how you need to do it. So as I was talking about, this is our drive net right here. This is the process that we use to pick geese up off a golf course and move them into that drive net. In years past, we kind of worked with our drone pilots to use drones. Again, for the average citizen, don't use a drone on migratory birds. But us being part of the government, we get to play with some different techniques and experiment and play with things. Bigger drones work better, I will say that. The small little Mavic drones, they don't like them at all, and they do harass they actually come after the little drone. So we have some bigger octocopter type drones that actually work really well for bringing birds to us at long distance. But the birds are walked basically on dry land. They will walk just fine right into the end of that net right there. And then we can load them up into a trailer and we can take them off for final disposition if wherever we need to go for that. And that's basically how we kind of get to our end of our questions and program. So any questions about that process? Man, it's a quiet group out there, isn't it?
Yes, I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay. Well, I apologize for the technical difficulties. So that's basically in a nutshell. We are happy to assist any of our municipalities, any of our residents in the North Texas area with any of their geese or domestic ducks. I don't have too many folks taking up on the domestic ducks. I'm a firm believer with Rachel that our cities should have no wildlife feeding ordinances so that we can control that situation a little better. It's not meant to count on everybody with that rule, but it's meant to have it there when we need those folks that just won't follow the rules for everybody. And it is a good thing to have not having domestic ducks in all of our ponds.
very much. For those of y'all that are still in the meeting, I did post a survey in the chat box. If you would take a few minutes to complete that, we would greatly appreciate it. That helps Liz and myself as well as Adam as far as reporting back to the states in terms of our programs and what our audience information is looking for. So if you take a few minutes to fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. At this time, we'd like to open it up for any other questions. And if there are not any other questions, then we will go ahead and conclude the meeting. Rachel, Adam, thank you for being our presenters today. Great information. So we will see y'all down the road, and everybody have a great Friday afternoon.